This has also created a very, very unique Japanese sound that if you actually if you listen to the Western music, you would hear a very, very clear difference. For the Western market, the Western sound is very much dictated by measure, I think, by numbers. So there's a beat, it's dictated by the beat. But in Japan, it's a little bit more natural because it's dictated by their breathing. So that's why there's a bit more vocal acrobatics. I don't know if that's the right term. There's a bit more vocal acrobatics in the Western market as opposed to the Japanese. They do have high notes, they have, they have acrobatics as well, but it is not as difficult as the ones that you would hear from the Western music, because as I've said, they are more dictated by the breathing. So it's a little bit easier to listen to. And Japan is actually the second biggest music market in the world, the first being the US. But this is nothing short of amazing because the US is actually 26 times bigger than Japan. But Japan managed to become the second strongest, and they are actually, in fact, bigger in physical music sales than the US. And this actually has a lot to do with their history. For the longest time, they were a closed country. I don't know if you can call them a hermit kingdom, but no one was allowed to travel out of Japan, and no one was allowed to travel in Japan. And they did that for a really long time. So that allowed them to sort of nurture their own identity and their own culture. The only country that actually colonized them was the US. Well, that's debatable, but the only country that practiced their reign over Japan is actually the US. But even so, the US actually did it in a very unique way. There were things that they changed in Japan, such as the laws. So they democratized it, they liberalized it, but they did not insist on certain things, such as the language. They allowed Japan to use the Japanese language in everything, in education, in their parliament. And I know that a lot of people will actually wonder why a country would use a foreign language in their parliament, but the Philippines do actually. we actually use the English language in our parliament and in writing our laws, but that's a different story. So going back to Japan, it actually leads me to my next point, because as I've said, the US sort of allowed Japan the free reign in most of their aspects of their daily lives and the way that they sort of run their society. It also allowed Japan to nurture their own language. So because the English language wasn't really taught in the schools in Japan, not until recently did they actually start becoming interested in the English language. That affected how their people consume their music, their commodity, because they would only consume something that they would understand. And that also rings true to their movie industry. Because they don't understand the English language, then they don't consume it. The only language that they understand is the Japanese language, so they would only consume products that are in Japanese. Also, the country itself is very beautiful, and so there's really not a whole lot of reason for their people to look in another country. They're essentially complete. They have 4 seasons, they have beautiful mountains, beautiful weather, beautiful flowers, so it's just a very, very beautiful country. So yeah, they don't feel the need to look out and see what else is out there because they have everything in their country. And I do think that affects, again, the way that they perceive themselves and their own identity. There is also a very strong support to their small businesses, and because they believe that these small businesses are actually the ones that will reinforce their own culture and their own identity. I have some Japanese friends, and they said that that's actually not the case, and the real reason that their government is very big in supporting small businesses is that it saves them from providing pension, social security to those that are retiring. If you allow people to work for as long as they could, then you don't actually need to support them. Well, that's a different story, and I don't want to dwell on it, but I know that there are, from the Japanese perspective, or at least from the Japanese government is very open about the fact that they like supporting small businesses because it nurtures their own culture. Along with that is their insistence in actually keeping the manufacturing industry of Japan in Japan, unlike other countries that would ship their jobs to the manufacturing of their products to other countries that may provide, cheaper labor. In Japan, they insist on keeping it in Japan, and so they're able to maintain the standards of the Japanese. They're able to maintain their desire to produce commodities that are Japanese because that's what they know. And again, it trickles down into how the Japanese are consuming their products, because they are making their own products, then they make products that support their own needs, support their own culture. Another thing that I really, really admire about the Japanese is how they are actually integrating their pop culture into their education. I wish that there are more countries that will do it, but in the Philippines itself, I don't really recall ever a time where we were taught how to appreciate our own literature. I know that we were actually required to read 2 books, but somehow it became a chore rather than something that we will appreciate. But again, I digress. Going back to Japan, they actually integrate their pop culture into their education. And it's not just about requiring their students to read or consume Japanese literature, but the way that they present their literature to the students. It allows the students to see the beauty in what they have. And yeah, I wish it's just a little bit more like the Japanese, where it's not just a chore. It's not just a book that you need to read and a book a book that you need to read, and then the next day the teacher is going to ask some questions. I wish that in schools there is an effort to make them appreciate the beauty of our own literature, and the Japanese, they're doing that. And then of course the strong economy of Japan, because I think only 12% of their population is classified as poor, in the poverty level. That means that they have a disposable income, so they have more money to spend on things that are not necessarily a necessity. So that gives them the power and the ability to actually consume art, and so that their own population nurtures that market. And speaking about population, they're not as big as the US, but still, considering that the US is 26 times bigger than Japan, you would think their population would also be 26 times bigger, but it's not actually the case. I think the Japanese has 127 million people, and the US has 320 maybe, so it's not quite half, but still, as I've said, you would think that because the US is 26 times bigger than Japan, then the Japanese would be, in terms of population, then we will also have 26 times more people, but that's not the case. So, but then again, it's just a population. Even if you have 200 million or 300 million, if that 300 million aren't really supporting your own product, then nothing will happen. But in terms of Japan, they have both the numbers and the willingness and the ability to actually support their own product. I guess all of this put together, the nurturing of their own culture, the consumption of their own products, keeping everything within Japan, this has also created a very, very unique Japanese sound that if you listen to the Western music, you would hear a very, very clear difference. For the Western market, the Western sound is very much dictated by measure, I think, by numbers. So there's a beat, it's dictated by the beat. But in Japan, it's a little bit more natural because it's dictated by their breathing. So that's why there's a bit more vocal acrobatics. I don't know if that's the right term. There's a bit more vocal acrobatics in the Western market, as opposed to the Japanese. They do have high notes. They have acrobatics as well, but it is not as difficult as the ones that you would hear from the Western music, because as I've said, they are more dictated by the breathing. So it's a little bit easier to listen to. Which leads me actually to my next point, which is my recommendations. So I have been on a binge the last couple of days on Japanese music, and here are 5 of my favorite right now favorite vocalists, female vocalists in Japan. Number 1 is Aimer. I actually first heard her for singing an OST of an animated movie, and the title, I think, of the song is Fate Stay Night, something like that. And then she just has a very beautiful voice. I decided to listen to her other works, so do check her other songs.
例えば君の顔に昔よりシワが増えてもそれでもいいんだ僕がギターを思うように弾けなくなっても心の歌は
Next is Anly. This is actually quite by accident. I discovered her quite by accident. I was just browsing through. I was in an intense YouTube session, and I came across one of her songs, which was actually posted by a fan. And she was doing a street performance, and she was doing a loop. So that's when you create different sounds. You create different sounds. You record it, and then you put it on a loop, and then you perform. And another famous artist who actually does that is Ed Sheeran. He would do that live, so he would loop songs. In fact, the one concert that I watched of Ed Sheeran, there was one, I think he did the entire concert on using a loop. So that's how I discovered her. The fan was overwhelmed because she actually just decided to post that performance of Anly, so she encouraged everybody to support Anly, to actually subscribe to Anly's page. I did, and I did not regret it because she has a really, really beautiful voice. Next is Aimyon. I've actually already recommended her, so please do. I also mentioned her in my other post. Another performer with a very, very beautiful voice. Last is, I don't know how to pronounce her name correctly, if it's Mone or Mone or Moni, but I first heard her because one of my favorite Japanese band is Radwimps, and they sang the OST of Your Name, the second highest grossing animated film in Japan. And she actually sang a version of that song, and she was just beautiful, beautiful voice. And so I decided to check out her other discography, and I hope that you will too.
いつもは尖ってた父の言葉が今日は温かく感じました。優しさ
Okay, so those are my 5 favorite ones. The current ones. So I have a lot of favorite Japanese performers and singers, but currently those are the 5 that I'm constantly listening to, and I hope that you give them a listen. In fact, I hope that you give the entire Japanese music industry a chance.